Jeremiah Sullivan was considered one of the most upstanding citizens in Albemarle County, Virginia. At 53 years old, he owned 200 acres of fertile farmland, employed several local workers, and attended church every Sunday without fail. His wife, Margaret, was known throughout the community for her charitable work, often taking in orphan children or those from troubled families. The Sullivan property sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense oak and maple forests that provided natural privacy from neighboring farms. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built in the federal style popular among Virginia's prosperous farmers. Behind it stood a large barn, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be a root cellar built into a hillside. Local residents often remarked on the Sullivans' generosity toward unfortunate children. Margaret Sullivan had a reputation for taking in orphans from the county poorhouse, and neighbors frequently saw children of various ages working around the property. The sight was so common that few questioned where all these children came from or why they rarely seemed to stay long. Mrs. Sullivan has such a good heart, townspeople would say, always helping those poor orphan souls find new homes. What the community didn't know was that the Sullivans had developed a carefully orchestrated system. Jeremiah would travel to neighboring counties, visiting poorhouses, orphanages, and even approaching desperate families during times of economic hardship. He presented himself as a benevolent benefactor who could provide these children with good homes, education, and opportunities for a better life. The county records show that between 1829 and 1834, the Sullivans had officially placed over 60 children with suitable families throughout Virginia and beyond. They maintained meticulous paperwork, forged references from fictional families, and even created elaborate stories about the children's new lives in distant states. But as Sheriff James Mitchell would later discover, none of these children had actually been placed with families. They had never left the Sullivan property at all. The first real suspicion arose when Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a schoolteacher from Charlottesville, began asking questions about several orphan children she had been teaching. 3 of her brightest students had suddenly disappeared after Jeremiah Sullivan visited the orphanage where they lived. Something wasn't right about that man, Mrs. Hartwell later testified. The children seemed frightened when he spoke to them, but the orphanage director was so impressed by his charitable offer that he dismissed their concerns. Mrs. Hartwell's persistent inquiries led her to contact other institutions in neighboring counties. What she discovered was a pattern that stretched across 5 counties and involved dozens of missing children. The autumn of 1830 forebrought an unusually early frost to Virginia, and with it, a growing sense of unease in the communities surrounding the Sullivan farm. Mrs. Hartwell's investigation had reached the ears of Sheriff James Mitchell, a methodical man in his 40s who had built his reputation on solving cases that others deemed impossible. Sheriff Mitchell began his investigation by visiting the various institutions where the Sullivans had recruited children. At the Richmond orphanage, the director showed him glowing letters supposedly written by families who had taken in Sullivan children. The letters describe happy, well-adjusted children thriving in their new homes across Virginia, Maryland, and even as far as Kentucky. But when Mitchell attempted to verify these addresses, he found that many of the towns mentioned didn't exist, and the families described in the letters were completely fictional. The carefully crafted deception began to unravel with each inquiry he made. The breakthrough came when Mitchell spoke with Thomas Hayes, a traveling merchant who frequently passed by the Sullivan property. Hayes reported seeing the same children working in the Sullivan fields month after month, despite the family's claims that they were constantly placing children in new homes. "I've got a good memory for faces," Hayes told the sheriff. "That boy with the red hair and the limp? I've been seeing him there for near 2 years now. But Mrs. Sullivan told the preacher just last month that he'd gone to a wonderful family in Richmond." Mitchell's investigation intensified when he discovered that several children who had supposedly been placed with families had actually been reported missing by relatives who had been searching for them. The web of lies was becoming impossible to maintain. The sheriff also noticed a disturbing pattern in the types of children the Sullivans selected. They consistently chose children who had no living relatives, those whose disappearance wouldn't trigger extensive searches. They preferred children between the ages of 6 and 12, old enough to work but young enough to be easily controlled. Local physician Dr. Samuel Wright later revealed that he had treated several children from the Sullivan property for unusual injuries over the years. They always came with Margaret Sullivan, who had elaborate explanations for every wound, every sign of malnutrition, Dr. Wright testified. I had my suspicions, but Margaret was so well regarded in the community that I doubted my own observations. The most chilling discovery came when Mitchell learned that the Sullivans had been operating their scheme for at least 5 years, possibly longer. Conservative estimates suggested that over 100 children had passed through their hands during this period. But where were they all? The property could only house so many children, yet neighbors rarely saw large groups of them at once. This question would lead Sheriff Mitchell to make a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What do you think happened to all those missing children? Have you ever encountered situations where something seemed off but you dismissed your instincts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes our gut feelings can save lives. Sheriff Mitchell knew he needed concrete evidence before confronting the Sullivans directly. In November 1834, he began conducting surveillance of property, positioning himself at various vantage points in the surrounding forest. What he observed during those cold autumn nights would forever change his understanding of human evil. The Sullivan property operated on a strict schedule. During daylight hours, a small group of children, usually no more than 8 or 10, could be seen working in the fields or around the buildings. They moved with mechanical precision, never playing or displaying the natural exuberance of childhood. Even from a distance, Mitchell could see that they were unnaturally thin and wore clothing that was little more than rags. But it was what happened after sunset that truly disturbed the sheriff. Each evening, he watched as Jeremiah Sullivan would disappear into what appeared to be the root cellar built into the hillside behind the main house. He would emerge hours later, often carrying what looked like empty food buckets and waste containers. The cellar had 2 entrances, one visible from the house, and another hidden entrance that could only be accessed through a narrow passage behind the barn. Mitchell noted that this second entrance was always heavily barred and guarded. During his surveillance, Mitchell also documented the frequent visits of well-dressed strangers to property. These visitors always arrived after dark, met privately with Jeremiah Sullivan, and left before dawn. Sometimes they departed alone, but often they were accompanied by 1 or 2 of the children who had been working the fields. The sheriff's most disturbing observation came on a particularly cold November night. He watched as Sullivan forced a group of children, some as young as 6 years old, to work by torchlight harvesting the last of the season's crops. The children moved slowly, clearly weakened by hunger and exhaustion, while Sullivan stood over them with what appeared to be a whip. When one small girl collapsed from exhaustion, Sullivan dragged her toward the hidden cellar entrance. Mitchell heard her terrified screams echo across the property before they were abruptly silenced by the closing of heavy wooden doors. Dr. Wright, who had become Mitchell's unofficial ally in the investigation, provided additional evidence. He revealed that Margaret Sullivan had been purchasing unusual quantities of medical supplies under the pretense of treating sick farm animals. The supplies included laudanum, a powerful opiate used to sedate patients, and large amount of bandages and antiseptics. No farm operation requires that much laudanum, Dr. Wright explained. I began to suspect she was using it to keep someone quiet. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Timothy Brown, a former employee of the Sullivans who had been dismissed after asking too many questions, approached Sheriff Mitchell with information that would trigger the raid. Brown revealed that he had accidentally discovered the true purpose of the hidden cellar entrance while searching for lost farm equipment. What he saw through a crack in the wooden door had haunted him for months. Dozens of children chained to the walls of an underground chamber, their faces gaunt with starvation, their eyes empty of hope. I wanted to help them, Brown confessed to Mitchell, but I was terrified of what the Sullivans would do to me if they found out I knew. I've carried this guilt every day since I left their employment. Armed with his testimony and his own observations, Sheriff Mitchell knew he had enough evidence to obtain a warrant, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would actually find when he finally entered that basement. Thank you so much for staying with this video until this point. We truly appreciate your time and engagement with this story. I assure you that the most shocking revelations are still to come, and what you'll discover in the next chapters will completely change how you view this case. On December 3rd, 1834, Sheriff Mitchell assembled a team of 6 deputies and Dr. Wright for what would become the most significant law enforcement operation in Albemarle County's history. The morning was bitterly cold, with frost covering the ground and bare tree branches reaching like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The team approached the Sullivan property just before dawn, hoping to catch the family before they could destroy evidence or harm any potential victims. Margaret Sullivan answered the door in her nightgown, her face immediately betraying her fear when she saw the warrant in Mitchell's hands. "This is preposterous," Jeremiah Sullivan declared when he was presented with the search warrant. "We are God-fearing people who have dedicated our lives to helping unfortunate children find better homes." While 2 deputies kept the Sullivan couple under guard in the main house, Mitchell led the search team directly to the hidden cellar entrance behind the barn. The heavy wooden door was secured with 3 separate iron locks and reinforced with metal bars. The sound of their tools breaking through the locks echoed across the property like gunshots. What they found beyond that door defied every expectation of human decency. The underground chamber stretched far beyond what should have been possible for a simple root cellar. The space had been excavated and expanded into a network of connected rooms, each serving a different horrific purpose. The air was thick with the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Dr. Wright would later identify as infected wounds. In the main chamber, 47 children were chained to the stone walls by iron shackles around their ankles. They ranged in age from approximately 5 to 14 years old, their bodies emaciated and their clothing reduced to filthy rags. Many bore obvious signs of physical abuse, bruises in various stages of healing, infected cuts, and the hollow-eyed stare of severe malnutrition. The children's reaction to their rescuers was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the discovery. Instead of crying out for help or showing relief, most cowered in terror, apparently believing that these new adults represented fresh dangers. Several children had been in the basement so long that they could barely speak, having been conditioned to remain silent at all times. Dr. Wright immediately began medical assessments, while the deputies worked to remove the shackles. Many of the children were too weak to stand, and several appeared to be suffering from serious illnesses that had gone untreated for weeks or months. In a separate chamber, the search team discovered evidence of the Sullivan's broader operation. Detailed records of child transactions, correspondence with buyers across multiple states, and financial records show that the family had earned substantial profits from their human trafficking enterprise. The most disturbing finding was a ledger that documented the inventory of children, listing them by physical characteristics, ages, and what the Sullivans coldly referred to as special attributes. Some entries included notes about which children were suitable for hard labor and which were preferred for household service. Sheriff Mitchell later wrote in his official report, "In 20 years of law enforcement, I had never encountered evil of this magnitude. These were not crimes of passion or desperation, but the calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society." The trial of Jeremiah and Margaret Sullivan began in February 1835 and drew spectators from across Virginia and neighboring states. The courthouse in Charlottesville was packed daily with citizens seeking to understand how such horrors could have existed in their midst. The evidence presented was overwhelming. 23 of the rescued children were healthy enough to testify, and their accounts painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even the most hardened observers. The children described being forced to work from dawn to dusk, being fed only scraps of food, and living in constant fear of punishment for the smallest infractions. Sarah Jenkins, a 12-year-old who had been in the basement for over a year, provided the most damning testimony. She described how the Sullivans would bring potential buyers to view the children like livestock, examining their teeth, testing their strength, and negotiating prices based on their perceived value. Mr. Sullivan would tell us we were being sold to families who would take better care of us, Sarah testified in a voice barely above a whisper. But we knew the truth. We knew we would never see those children again. The prosecution revealed that the Sullivans had been selling children to plantation owners, factory operators, and private individuals across the South and Midwest. The prices ranged from $50 to $200 per child, depending on their age, health, and perceived usefulness. Perhaps most shocking was the revelation that the Sullivans had been operating with the knowledge and cooperation of several local officials who had received bribes to overlook irregularities in their paperwork. 3 county officials were subsequently arrested and charged as accomplices. The defense attempted to argue that the Sullivans genuinely believed they were helping orphan children find better lives, but the physical evidence of abuse and the detailed financial records made this claim impossible to sustain. On March 15, 1835, both Jeremiah and Margaret Sullivan were found guilty on multiple charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and child abuse. In an era when such comprehensive charges were rarely brought, the judge sentenced Jeremiah Sullivan to death by hanging and Margaret Sullivan to life imprisonment. The case had immediate and far-reaching consequences. The Virginia legislature passed new laws requiring regular inspections of institutions caring for children and established more stringent procedures for child placements. The Sullivan case became a catalyst for similar reforms across the United States. Of the 47 children rescued from the basement, 39 survived their ordeal. They were gradually rehabilitated and placed with carefully vetted families, though many carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Several of the children later became advocates for child protection, using their experiences to prevent similar tragedies. The Sullivan property was eventually burned to ground by local residents who could not bear to see the buildings where such horrors had occurred. Today, the site is marked only by a small memorial stone placed by descendants of the survivors. The Sullivan family case remains one of the most disturbing examples of systematic child abuse in American history. It demonstrated how predators could operate successfully by exploiting society's trust and the vulnerability of orphan children. The case also showed how a community's willingness to look the other way could enable unspeakable crimes. This story serves as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability, and that protecting children requires constant vigilance from all members of society. The courage of individuals like Mrs. Hartwell and Sheriff Mitchell, who refused to ignore their suspicions, ultimately saved dozens of lives. What do you think about this case? Do you believe the justice served was adequate for such crimes? How do you think society today would handle a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspectives help us understand how much progress we've made in protecting our most vulnerable citizens. If this story impacted you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more true crime stories that shaped our history. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Don't miss our next video, The Orphanage of Horrors, What Really Happened in Salem, 1847. Another shocking true story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about 19th century America. Click now to watch this equally disturbing tale.